There's a moment, and I need you to pay attention to this because it only lasts about 3 seconds in real life, but it stretches out like taffy when you're standing in it. There's a moment when the universe shows you something it wasn't supposed to show you. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a fanfare or a countdown or a glowing indicator on your HUD that says warning. You are about to see something that will change the way you think about everything. It just happens. And then you spend the rest of your life trying to explain it to people who weren't there. I'm going to try. I was standing in sub-level 9 of the Valdres Transit Hub on the colony moon of Erethes IV when it happened. The air smelled like recycled nitrogen and old ship fuel, and something faintly sweet that I later found out was the ambient pheromone cloud the Kalahari vendors pump into their stall sections to attract customers. The lighting down in 9 was that particular shade of sickly amber that maintenance teams use in infrastructure corridors. Not warm, not cold, just present. Just enough to see by. Just enough that you couldn't pretend you were somewhere nicer. And Corporal Marcus Teo, 23 years old, 2 years out of the Terran Expeditionary Infantry, no particular commendations, no particular history of doing remarkable things, was standing between a Covenant enforcement officer and a woman who looked like she was made of pale glass and old night. The officer had a plasma disruptor leveled at her sternum. Marcus had nothing. He hadn't even drawn his sidearm. He was just standing there, between the gun and her, arms out slightly, like he was trying to catch something. And the woman, the vampire, she was looking at him like she had never in 800 years seen anything like what she was currently seeing. Like the concept of it had never occurred to her as a real possibility. Like she didn't have the word for it yet. And she said, very quietly, almost not loud enough to hear over the hum of the ventilation shafts and the distant announcement boards cycling through their languages. Why would you do this? That's where I need to start. But I can't start there, not really, because if I start there, you won't understand what made it mean something. You'll think it was just a standoff, just two people in a hallway, just one more incident in the long, grinding, unremarkable record of human-alien covenant friction that fills the transit logs of every major hub in the outer colonies. I need to go back about 6 hours. I need to start with the inspection. Set up. Erethes IV. Colony Moon, technically, though nobody who lived there called it that. They called it Erethes, full stop. Like it had earned the right to be its own thing, which after 340 years of continuous habitation and 2 full cycles of terraforming expansion, it probably had. The surface was cold and rocky and geologically restless. Erethes sat in the tidal influence of its gas giant parent, which meant the crust flexed slightly, just slightly, every 22 hours, and you could feel it if you were standing outside near the northern settlement towers. Not an earthquake, more like the ground remembering it was alive, like it was breathing. Most of the population lived underground. Not because of the cold, though the surface temperatures were not inviting. Underground because that's where the work was. Erethes was a hub. Transit, commerce, cargo redistribution, species accommodation. The Valdres Transit Hub was the largest structure on the moon, larger than 3 of the original settlement towers combined, and it ran 28 hours a day on a schedule that did not care what the surface was doing, what the tidal flex was doing, what the gas giant overhead was doing. It processed somewhere around 40,000 travelers every standard rotation. Different species, different politics, different tolerances for ambient temperature and atmospheric composition, and what passed for acceptable food. The hub had 17 sublevels. Sublevels 1 through 7 were commercial, the kind of thing you'd recognize from any major transit center across the compact. Stalls, restaurants, rest facilities, currency exchange, customs processing. Loud, bright, crowded in that particular way of spaces where everyone is going somewhere and nobody is staying. Sublevels 8 through 12 were infrastructure and logistics, cargo processing, mechanical systems, the long maintenance corridors where the real work happened and nobody came unless they had a specific reason, amber lighting, recycled air, the smell of grease and fuel and impermanence. Sublevels 13 through 17 were restricted. I didn't have clearance for 13 through 17. Most people didn't. The Covenant Enforcement Division, the CED, which was what most people called them, though the shorter name that rhymed with a particularly unpleasant feeling was also popular. The CED had jurisdiction over the lower levels. Their mandate in the outer colonies was, in principle, to provide security and regulatory oversight in transit hubs that fell under the Combined Galactic Compact's charter. In practice, they were the long arm of the hegemonic bloc, the three oldest spacefaring civilizations in the Compact who had decided somewhere around 150 years ago that their preferred version of order ought to be everyone else's version of order. The bloc didn't love humanity. They didn't hate us exactly. Hatred implies you think about something enough to have feelings about it. The bloc's position on humans was more like an administrator who has just discovered an unexpected variable in a long-running calculation. Annoying, possibly useful, requiring management. The CED officers stationed at Valdris were Kathek, one of the block species, tall, gray-skinned, four-armed, though two of the arms were much shorter and served a more manipulative function than a strength function. They had eyes that were wide-set and yellow and processed light slightly differently than human eyes, which meant they wore tinted visors in most of the hub's lighting conditions. They were not individually cruel. I want to be clear about that. They were procedural. They followed rules. They applied those rules evenly and without particular warmth, the way a machine applies a rule, and the rules they were applying were, well, that's the thing, isn't it? That's always the thing. The rules were the block's rules. And the block's rule had a lot of things to say about certain species. Rivas Solon arrived at the Valdris hub at the start of the evening processing cycle. I know her name now. I didn't know it then. Then she was just a figure I noticed in the customs line because you couldn't really not notice her. She was tall in that particular way that didn't announce itself through posture or aggression, just through fact. Pale. The kind of pale that looks like light is passing through the skin rather than bouncing off it. Dark hair that she wore pulled back in a practical arrangement that somehow still looked like it had been put together with a great deal of care, or perhaps had simply stopped needing care a long time ago and now sat that way on its own, out of habit. She wore civilian travel clothes, nothing remarkable. The kind of layered, neutral-toned outfit that people wear when they're trying to get through a transit hub without being noticed, which is most sensible travelers. She had a transit case in her left hand, the battered, scuffed, multiply-stickered kind that speaks to a long history of actual travel rather than decorative travel. The kind you buy when you're 20 and still have 70-odd years ahead of you and don't see any reason to invest in something nicer yet. Except she'd had that case for what I later found out was closer to 230 years, so the stickers were genuinely historical. She moved through the customs processing with the efficiency of someone who had done it several thousand times. She had done it several thousand times. Rivas Solon was what the taxonomical guides of the Compact call a Nocthari Primarch, one of the old vampire clans that had existed on Earth long before humanity developed space travel, and which had therefore been incorporated, somewhat awkwardly, into humanity's official species registration when humanity joined the Compact 300 years ago. The Nocthari were not numerous. There were perhaps 40,000 of them in the entire galaxy, most living among human populations in the outer and mid-colonies. A few scattered through the core worlds where they ran businesses or maintained libraries, or pursued the kind of multi-century scholarly projects that only make sense if you have multi-century spans of time available to you. They were not dangerous. That distinction, and I cannot stress this enough given what I'm about to describe, that distinction had been formally established by the Compact's own medical and behavioral review boards twice. The dietary requirements that had made them terrifying in pre-spacefaring human mythology had been replaced, first by synthesized products on Earth, and then, as the technology improved, by a standard nutritional compound that was manufactured in 3 different Compact facilities and available at virtually every major transit hub in the galaxy. They didn't hunt. They hadn't hunted, most of them, in over a century. They were, and this is the part the block had a problem with, they were registered as a human subspecies, which meant they were covered under Terran Compact charter protections, which meant they had the same rights as humans in transit hubs, which was, to the hegemonic bloc, an ongoing insult to what they considered reasonable species taxonomy. The bloc had their own classification for the Nocthari. Category 7 Biohazard. It wasn't official Compact classification. It wasn't legally binding. It was bloc internal policy. The kind of internal policy that, when you control the enforcement divisions in the outer colonies, tends to function like law anyway. I should tell you about Marcus. Marcus Teo was stationed at Valdris on a liaison detail, Terran Expeditionary Infantry, which in the outer colonies mostly meant he did a lot of standing in places where TEI presence was technically required by charter, but practically irrelevant because nobody with a gun ever started anything. They needed the TEI to finish. Most of his time was paperwork, compliance documentation, the slow administrative grind of being the human representative in a space that was, politically speaking, not particularly interested in humans. He was 23. He had brown eyes and a round, open face, and a slightly crooked lower tooth that you only saw when he was really laughing. He wore his uniform the way most young soldiers wear their uniforms, well enough to pass inspection, not so perfectly pressed that it looked like he was trying to impress someone. He had a habit of tapping the knuckles of his right hand against whatever surface was nearby when he was thinking, a rhythm that was always the same, 4 beats, pause, 2 beats, that he was almost certainly not aware of doing. He was not a hero. I want to be clear about that too. He wasn't the kind of person who showed up in the record as remarkable. His service file was clean and thoroughly unremarkable. He'd done well enough in training, well enough in the field, caused no particular problems and solved no particular problems. He'd been assigned to Valdris because someone in the rotation office had his name in the next slot, and Valdris needed a body. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have a philosophy. He had whatever he had, whatever it is that makes a person step into a space between a gun and another person, when every sensible instinct says not to, and we'll get to that. Rivas arrived at Customs Processing Gate 7 at approximately 19:40 Hub Standard Time. The Gate 7 officer, Kathek, like all the CED officers, though I never caught his designation number, processed her transit documentation with the same procedural efficiency that the CED officers brought to everything. He scanned her transit case. He scanned her identification chip. He paused. He scanned the identification chip again. Rivas had been through this enough times that she recognized the pause for what it was. She kept her expression neutral. She had kept her expression neutral through this particular pause, in this particular type of interaction, for the better part of 2 centuries. The pause was the moment when the system flagged her Nocthari classification. What happened next depended on which system they were running, which officer was working the desk, and what particular instructions the local CED branch was operating under that rotation. At Valdris, The local CED branch was operating under a directive that had been quietly updated 3 weeks earlier. The directive, as I later found out through the incident report filings, classified Nakhtari travelers under Enhanced Screening Protocol. Enhanced Screening Protocol was a phrase that meant different things in different contexts. In the context of Valdres's lower levels, under Kathek's CED supervision, it meant detained. The Gate 7 officer called 2 additional officers over. Rivad did not argue. She was very still. That particular stillness that you don't see in most people, not tense, not rigid, just completely quiet in her own skin, like she had decided at some point a very long time ago that stillness was the most effective response to certain categories of situation, and had practiced it until it was no longer a decision. They took her transit case. They told her she would need to accompany them for secondary processing. She said yes. She said it the way you say yes when you have said yes to this particular request so many times that the word has lost its meaning and become purely functional. They took her to Sublevel 9. This is where I was. I was in Sublevel 9 because I work cargo documentation. I know, not glamorous, but I've been doing it for 11 years, and there's a particular satisfaction to getting the weight manifests right, to knowing that the shipment of medical-grade materials heading to the Kelly Station outpost is correctly logged and correctly sealed, and is going to arrive intact and on time, and I will take that satisfaction over glamour most days. I was doing end-of-shift reconciliation in the corridor between loading Bay 9 Alpha and the secondary customs processing suite when they brought her through. I saw her face. She looked, I don't know how to describe it exactly. She looked the way old people sometimes look in hospital waiting rooms, not frightened, not angry, just accustomed to the machinery of being treated as a category rather than a person, to knowing exactly what was happening and knowing exactly that there was nothing to do about it. It made me feel something I couldn't immediately name. Then I went back to my weight manifests because that was my job and what was I going to do, and the answer to that question was nothing. I was cargo documentation. I had no authority in a secondary processing situation, and I finished my shift and went to the staff canteen for the meal break. That's where Marcus was. He was eating something that looked like it was trying to be a bowl of noodles and partially succeeding. He had the 4-2 knuckle rhythm going on the edge of the table. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, tap. And he was looking at the security feed monitor on the wall that showed various corridor cameras on a rotation cycle. Most people don't really watch the security feeds in the canteen. They're there for compliance. The hub requires monitoring. The monitoring feeds are displayed in common areas. Most people look at them the way you look at a television in a waiting room. Aware of it, not engaged with it. Marcus was watching. I sat down 2 seats away from him. There were only 8 seats in the whole canteen, and we were the only 2 people using it at that hour, and I started eating something that was attempting to be a curry. They took a Nakhtari into 9C, he said, without preamble, without looking away from the feed. I glanced up. Enhanced Screening Protocol, I said. He looked at me then. That's the 3rd one this rotation, he said. I hadn't known that, 3rd one. I've been watching the feed since my shift started. He pointed at the monitor. 3 Nakhtari, all pulled to 9C, none of them have come out. 9C was the deepest of the secondary processing suites in Sublevel 9. It wasn't restricted, technically, not in the sense of requiring clearance. It was just far enough back and far enough down that you didn't end up there by accident. The kind of room that exists because someone needed a room and didn't think very carefully about why a room like that might be concerning. Processing takes a while, I said, which was true and also felt inadequate. Marcus looked back at the feed. They detained a Nakhtari on Keselm Station 8 months ago, he said. Enhanced Screening Protocol. She was there for 11 days before the compact liaison office even knew about it. By the time they got the paperwork sorted, she'd been held in a room with no nutrient compound access for 9 days. He paused. 9 days. I knew what he was referring to obliquely. Nakthari without nutritional compound access experienced something that the medical literature called acute dietary deprivation syndrome, which was a very clinical way of describing what was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily unpleasant physical deterioration. Not fatal in short-term cases, but not comfortable. And deeply humiliating in ways that went beyond the physical. The Nakthari relationship with their dietary requirements was bound up in a lot of complicated cultural and historical weight that I, as a human, could understand intellectually but probably not fully appreciate. She filed a complaint, Marcus said. CED internal review found no violation. Block policy superseded charter protections in the specific jurisdictional zone of Kesselm Station. End of review. He said it flatly, not angrily, just the way you state a fact that you find unacceptable. I ate my curry. What are you thinking about doing? I asked. He looked at me again. Nothing, he said, and then a beat later, I don't know. He finished his food. I finished mine. We went our separate ways. I had 1 more hour of documentation to complete before my shift ended, and he was presumably going back to whatever liaison detail tasks needed a body in a corridor. I didn't think about it much more. I was in the loading bay 9 Alpha access corridor, with my tablet and my weight manifests, when I heard the voices from down the hall. Build tension. The corridors in sublevel 9 are long and narrow, wide enough for a loader unit to pass, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side without their shoulders touching. The walls are service conduit gray, and they're lined with pipe runs and conduit bundles that are labeled in 6 languages, because 6 was the minimum the compact required even if nobody in a given sublevel could read 3 of them. Sound carries in those corridors. Not clearly. There's always a background hum from the ventilation and the mechanical systems that blurs the edges of things, but it carries. You hear the shape of a conversation before you hear the words. What I heard was the shape of a confrontation, the particular cadence of authority being asserted, and underneath it, quieter, steadier, the shape of someone not arguing back. I stood still for a moment with my tablet in my hands. I didn't go toward it. I stood still. Then the pitch of it changed. I'm not sure how to describe what I heard in those 3 seconds, except to say that it was the pitch of an escalation, something crossing a threshold, some shift in the air pressure of the situation. And whatever it was, it pulled me down the corridor before I'd consciously made the decision to walk. The corridor bent left at a junction box, a big gray box housing the environmental management systems for the whole sublevel, with its own perpetual mechanical breathing, and around that bend was the access passage for 9C. I stopped at the bend. There were 3 CED officers in the passage. 2 of them were flanking the door to 9C. One of them was in the middle of the passage. In the middle of the passage, standing very straight, the way soldiers stand when they've been asked to stand and are still deciding whether or not they're going to, was Marcus. And in front of Marcus, between him and the door, was Rivas Solon. She'd been released from the processing suite, I found out later. Or rather, she'd been released to the passage, which was a technical fulfillment of the processing protocol that kept her technically outside the restricted area while still functionally keeping her controlled, because the 3 CED officers had followed her out and 2 of them were blocking the corridor in both directions. The third was in front of her, with his plasma disruptor drawn. Not pointed, not yet, but drawn. Marcus was between her and the 3rd officer. He'd put himself there. I'd arrived, I realized, at the precise moment when that choice had just been made. The CED officer, the one with the drawn weapon, was speaking in Kathek official tone, which has a particular quality to it. It's not a shout. It's not aggressive exactly. It's the tone of someone explaining something they believe to be self-evident and finding the necessity of explanation somewhat tedious. The translation overlay in my ear gave me, "You are obstructing an enforcement action. Step aside and identify yourself, or you will also be subject to detention." Marcus said very calmly, "I'm identifying myself. I'm Corporal Marcus Teo, Terran Expeditionary Infantry, Liaison Detail, Badge 774 Erethes. And I'm telling you respectfully, officer, that this individual is a registered citizen of the Terran Compact, covered under Charter Section 12, Paragraph 4, and does not require further processing without a formal warrant issued by Compact Civil Authority." He knew the regulation. He'd looked it up. I found out later he'd spent 20 minutes during his meal break pulling up the relevant sections of the Compact Charter on his personal comm, because he'd seen 3 Nocthari go into 9C, and none come out, and he decided he wanted to know what the actual regulation said. The CED officer said something in Kathek official tone that the translation overlay rendered as, "Block Directive 817 supersedes Charter Section 12 in enhanced biohazard screening scenarios. This individual is classified Category 7. Step aside." "With respect," Marcus said, "Block Directive 817 is an internal policy document with no jurisdictional authority in a compact chartered transit facility. I have the relevant charter language on my comm if you'd like to review it." He actually held up his personal comm. Just held it up toward the CED officer like he was offering it for review. The CED officer had not lowered his weapon. The 2 flanking officers hadn't moved. The corridor was very quiet except for the ventilation hum and the distant sound of the environmental management box doing its perpetual breathing around the bend. Rivas Solon was standing just behind Marcus's shoulder. She was looking at the back of his head. That was the thing I couldn't stop seeing, even then, even from where I was standing around the bend with my manifest tablet clutched to my chest. She was looking at the back of his head with an expression I'd never seen on anyone's face before. And I'd seen a lot of faces in 11 years of working Sub-Level 9. She'd been standing in processing holding for almost 4 hours. I found this out later from the incident report. 4 hours in a 6x4 room with no nutrient compound access, no clear indication of when the processing would conclude, and 3 CED officers cycling through who did not speak directly to her, but did speak at length to each other in Kathek rapid flow dialect. The fast version, the version that translation overlays can parse about 60% of, about what the protocol said they could and couldn't do without a senior officer sign-off. She had not argued. She had not demanded her rights. She had sat in the chair they put her in and she had waited with the stillness that she had practiced into reflex, and she had thought, this was her account later, which I read in the report, she had thought, this is the 11 days again. This is always going to be the 11 days. The Kesselm Station incident. She'd known the woman. Not well, the Nocthari community wasn't large enough for any 2 members of it to be entirely unknown to each other, but she'd known her. She knew what those 11 days had been. And she had sat in the chair and she had waited. When the CED officer came back after 4 hours and told her to come with him, she had come. When they'd walked her into the passage, and she'd seen the corridor blocked in both directions, she had processed this with a particular kind of readiness. Not resignation. She told me later when I finally talked to her that she wanted to make sure I understood it wasn't resignation. It was preparation. The way you brace yourself against a surface when you know something heavy is coming. You're not accepting the impact. You're just making sure you can absorb it. Then Marcus had appeared from the opposite end of the passage. He'd been doing an infrastructure check. The TEI liaison detail required a rotating check of all sublevels, a formality that mostly meant walking the corridors and logging your presence, and 9 had been on his list for that hour. He'd rounded the corner. He'd seen the configuration: CED officers, Nocthari woman, weapon drawn, corridor blocked. And he'd walked into the middle of it. Ravat told me later that she'd seen him coming from the moment he turned the corner. Her night adaptive vision was significantly better than human standard in the amber lighting, which meant she'd had about 8 seconds more than anyone else to process the fact that a human soldier she had never met was walking toward a situation that had nothing to do with him. She said she'd assumed he was going to add to it, that he was going to make it worse. The way things like this sometimes got worse when someone in a uniform decided they had jurisdiction, and the direction they wanted to push things was the same direction it was already going. She said that was what 800 years of accumulated experience told her to assume. Then he'd stepped between her and the officer with the drawn weapon and held up his comm and started talking about Charter Section 12, Paragraph 4. And she'd been looking at the back of his head. Because she hadn't known. She had genuinely not known that was a possibility. The senior CED officer arrived at the passage at approximately 22:15 Hub Standard Time. I'd stayed around the corner. I know that sounds cowardly, and I've thought about it a lot since. I stayed around the corner because I was cargo documentation, and I had no jurisdiction and no weapon and nothing useful to contribute except, possibly, a witness account if things went very wrong. And I told myself that was the reason I stayed, and I believe it was mostly true. The senior officer was older, more decorated. His translation overlay spoke standard compact common rather than official tone, which was a small thing that made a large difference in the feeling of the conversation. He assessed the situation. He looked at the 2 flanking officers. He looked at the officer with the drawn weapon. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Ravat. He said, "Corporal, what is the nature of your involvement in this processing action?" Marcus said, "I'm asserting charter protections on behalf of this individual, sir. She's a registered Terran compact citizen. I have documentation if you'd like to review it." The senior officer said, "I'm aware of the charter protections." A pause. He said it the way a tired person admits something they didn't particularly want to admit. "I'm aware of the charter protections. Block Directive 817 does not carry enforcement weight in this facility," Marcus said, steady, patient, like he was explaining something to someone who already knew it. "I think you know that, sir." Another pause. Longer. The corridor breathed. The senior officer looked at the officer with the drawn weapon. He made a gesture, 2 of his smaller arms moving in a particular configuration, that the translation overlay recognized as a stand-down signal in Kathek enforcement protocol. The weapon was lowered. It was holstered. The senior officer said, "The processing action is closed. The individual may proceed to her transit point. A beat. I will require your incident report by end of cycle, Corporal." "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "I'll have it to you." The senior officer looked at him for another moment. Not with anger, I watched his face, or what I could read of it, and it wasn't anger. It was something more like the expression of a person encountering a variable they hadn't planned for. Then he turned and walked back down the passage, and the 2 flanking officers went with him, and the 3rd went with them. And it was just Marcus and Ravat in the corridor. Climax. I stayed around the corner. I know, but I stayed, and I'm glad I did, because what happened next is the part I've been trying to tell people about ever since, and I had a clear line of sight down the passage from my position at the bend, and I watched it happen. Marcus turned around. He was checking on her. That was the first thing he did, turned to look at her with that round, open face, and the expression of someone who had just done something that used up a lot of energy and was now wondering what the correct next step was. Rivas Solon was looking at him. I mentioned her expression before, the one I'd never seen on anyone's face. I'm going to try harder to describe it. It wasn't gratitude, or it wasn't only gratitude, and the gratitude part wasn't even the most dominant thing. Gratitude is a fairly legible expression. I know what it looks like. I've seen it on the faces of people who have been helped and know it and feel it. This was something that didn't have a clear shape in the human emotional vocabulary. It was the look, I think, of a person encountering a thing that their accumulated history has told them does not exist, and having the accumulated history and the thing exist simultaneously in the same moment, and not yet knowing what to do about the fact that the history was wrong. 800 years of accumulated history. That's what I was watching rearrange itself on her face. Marcus said, "Are you all right?" She said yes, reflexive, the answer she always gave. Then she corrected herself. "No, I've been in the processing suite for 4 hours without compound access." He said, "Are you, is that, should I get a medical team?" She looked at him, a complicated look. It's not medical, it's just uncomfortable, a beat, and humiliating. He nodded, not with the nod of someone performing understanding, with the nod of someone who is actually taking a thing on board and processing it and accepting it as a real thing that happened. "I'm sorry," he said. She studied him. "You don't have anything to apologize for," she said. "You weren't in the processing suite." "No," he said. "But I'm still sorry it happened." A long pause. The ventilation hum, the distant boards, the mechanical breathing of the environmental management box. She said, "Why would you do this?" Not asking about the apology, asking about all of it, the stepping into the corridor, the charter section 12, the holding up of the comm, the standing between a drawn weapon and a stranger. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He tapped his knuckle against his thigh. 4 beats, pause, 2 beats. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And then, the thing I've been trying to explain." She laughed. Not the polite, abbreviated laugh of a social interaction, not the bitter laugh of someone who finds something painfully ironic. She laughed the way a person laughs when something strikes them as genuinely, unexpectedly funny, and also somewhat bewildering, and also, and this is the part I'm still working out, somewhat like relief. Like something she'd been holding for a very long time had just been unexpectedly set down. "The right thing to do," she repeated, like she was tasting the words. "I have been traveling through compact space for 230 years, Corporal. I have been detained 6 times. I have been subjected to enhanced processing procedures 14 times. I have filed 9 formal complaints with the relevant oversight bodies. I have sat in rooms that were not comfortable, for periods of time that were not brief, and I have waited, and I have thought many things during that waiting." She paused. "It has never occurred to me," she said, "not once in 230 years to think. Perhaps a stranger will step into the middle of this and cite Charter Section 12. Marcus said, "I'm sorry it took this long." And she looked at him again. That expression again. A little differently this time. Like the rearrangement was still happening. Like the thing that her history had told her doesn't exist was continuing to exist despite everything, and her face was still figuring out what to do about that. "Why would you risk your position?" she said. "Your liaison posting. If the senior officer had decided differently, if there had been a formal complaint filed against you for obstruction, then I'd have dealt with it," Marcus said simply. "I know what the charter says. I was on solid ground." "You didn't know the senior officer would stand down." "No," he admitted, "I didn't." "Then you took a risk." "Yeah," for to knuckle rhythm on his thigh, "I did." "For a stranger." "For a person." He looked slightly confused by the framing. You're a person. You were the situation was wrong. I knew what the regulation said. It was wrong. Ravasolin was very still. That deep practice stillness. But something in it had shifted. The quality of it had changed. It wasn't the braced stillness anymore. It was something else, something softer and more complicated. I have met many humans, she said slowly. In 800 years, I knew humans before your species had metal tools. I knew them before you had cities. I watched them build the first cities. I was in Rome in the 2nd century. I was in Samarkand in the time of the Silk Roads. I was in Cape Town when the first ships left for the stars. A pause. I know what humans are. Marcus waited. And still, she said, still, you managed to surprise me. He walked her to the transit processing level. He didn't have to. His shift wasn't covering that sector. He just walked with her, through the amber-lit corridors of Sublevel 9, past the loading bays and the environmental management boxes, and the stacks of cargo containers waiting for their manifests, up the service elevator to Level 4, through the commercial transit hall with its loud light and its crowd press and its vendor pheromones. She didn't like the pheromones, I could tell. She kept her jaw slightly set in a way that suggested they were irritating to her senses, though she didn't say anything. And to the main transit processing gate. He stood with her while she resubmitted her documentation through the standard processing channel rather than the enhanced one. He stood beside the gate while the processing officer, not CED this time, a standard hub employee, a Villani woman with kind eyes who I recognized from Level 3, processed Rivaz's transit case and her identification chip and handed them back with a smile. Rivaz took them. She turned to Marcus. She said, I don't know how to thank you. I'm not sure I have the language for it. Marcus said, you don't have to. I need to, she said. I'm 800 years old. I'm not good at owing debts. He laughed at that, the real laugh, the one that showed the crooked lower tooth. You don't owe me anything. You're making this very difficult, she said. A slight tone, dry, the very beginning edges of warmth. I am trying to give you a formal expression of gratitude, and you keep deflecting it. I'm a soldier, he said. Deflection is a core competency. She looked at him. And then, quietly, in a way that felt like it cost her something, the way things that are true and important sometimes cost something to say, she said. In 800 years, no one has ever stepped in front of a weapon for me. He said, I'm sorry for that too. She said, stop apologizing for things that aren't your fault. All right, I'll try. You won't succeed. Humans don't. A pause. It's one of the things it's a thing about humans. She seemed to choose her words with unusual care. You apologize for things that aren't yours. As if the world's wrongs are somehow your personal responsibility to make right. Isn't that kind of the point? She was quiet. For us, maybe, she said finally. I don't know for the ones who do it. She looked at him with those pale eyes. For the ones who actually do it. The transit board cycled through their announcement. Rivaz's ship was called in 3 languages. She picked up her transit case. Marcus Tio, she said, Corporal, Terran Expeditionary Infantry, Badge 774 Erethes. She had memorized it from when he'd said it in the passage. Of course she had. I will remember that. He said, safe travels. She said, I've been traveling for 800 years. I'm quite good at it. She walked through the gate. She didn't look back. But at the last moment, at the point where the gate corridor bent left, and the space beyond it would have been the boarding section, and she would have been gone, she paused. Just for a second. She didn't turn around. She just paused. And then she walked on. Marcus stood at the gate for a moment. Then he turned around. He nearly walked into me. I'd been following at what I told myself was a polite distance. I want to be honest about that. I was curious. I am a curious person, and I had just watched something I didn't have words for. He looked at me, slightly surprised, then not surprised, really just present. "You were in the passage," he said. "Yeah, I was around the corner. I thought I heard someone. I did witness it, if that helps. With the incident report." He nodded, thinking about that. "Mites, thank you." We stood in the transit hall for a moment. Around us, the crowd moved with its own logic, travelers going places, vendors attending to things, the Kalahari pheromone cloud doing its ambient work on everyone's commercial instincts. "That was a brave thing," I said. He looked slightly uncomfortable. The way people look when you say something about them that they haven't decided how to receive yet. "She'd been in that room for 4 hours," he said. He paused. "She looked like she'd been in a lot of those rooms over a lot of years." I didn't say anything. "She probably wasn't going to argue," he said. "She was just going to wait it out. Because that's what she's learned to do." He looked down the transit hall. I couldn't watch that and do nothing. That's not," he stopped himself, tried again. "It's not even about being brave. It's just there are things you can't unknow. Once you know what the regulation says, once you see what's happening right in front of you, you can't unknow it and then stand there and do nothing." I thought about that. I thought about my manifest tablet and my weight reconciliations and the way I'd stood in the passage corridor and thought, "I'm cargo documentation. I have no authority here," and gone to the canteen. "I didn't do anything," I said, "when I saw her earlier." He looked at me, not with judgment. "You're here now," he said. "That's something."